Hello, welcome to Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. I'm MaryLee Moulton, a member and your host for this program. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that supports neither candidates nor parties. Each program we talk about important public policy issues, and we hope you'll discuss these issues, and at election time you'll be ready and willing to go vote. Our guest today is Joel Hebrink, Adjunct Professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Joel received his BA in Political Science and Economics from St. Cloud University. He has a Master's in Political Science from UNO. He's been an Adjunct Professor at Methodist College. Thanks for being with us today, Joel.
Thank you for having me.
So in 2015, Webster's named the suffix ism its word of the year. We often hear words like liberalism, conservatism, socialism, and many other isms used in political discussion, and we thought it would be interesting to take some time to discuss these different isms to make sure that we really understand their meaning and how they're used to move political discussion. For each of these discussions, we're going to look at for this ease of discussion, we're going to look at two groupings of isms. First, we'll talk about liberalism, conservatism, progressivism, and liberalism. And then we'll discuss capitalism, communism, socialism, and democratic socialism. So Joel, when people hear the word liberalism, they think of policies that lean left. But historically, liberalism is quite different. So can you tell us about the pre-political meaning of liberalism?
Well, liberalism came about right around John Locke in the 14th century. Mm-hmm. And he developed an idea or built a theory that people should be able to do what they want to do, just to follow their own goals and strive for their own goals. And generally that's sort of where the idea that laissez-faire came mm-hmm. from, like the hands-off by the government. And they saw utility as the foundation for policy decisions mm-hmm. and how would it best suit society in itself as a whole, mm-hmm. I guess. Okay. And Locke actually used the term life, liberty, and property. And then Thomas Jefferson changed that a little bit to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. And apparently, you can correlate property with the pursuit of happiness. Mm-hmm. And so then from the 17th to 19th century, liberals like John Locke, or classical liberals, mm-hmm. we use that term typically. John Locke wrote his two treatises on government, and that was widely considered one of the main theorists on the social contract. Mm-hmm. In that arguing that really the only role of government was to be a third party to resolve disputes. Mm-hmm. Then the founder of, one of the founders of classical liberalism would then be Adam Smith, who was
Wealth of Nations.
Yeah, mm-hmm. very well known for Wealth of Nations. And his ideas correlated or corresponded with John Locke mm-hmm. in that the state or the government should be hands-off and just let a free market work, and that would be the best way to provide opportunity or the ability to grow as a person, personally and economically.
So this liberalism is really where our founding fathers get the things that they put into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
so that's kind of where this liberalism
very much
leads.
So, yeah.
Okay. So can you talk about the ties between liberty and private property? Because that's really important too in all of this original liberalism.
Locke actually went to great lengths or significant lengths to pose the idea that our labor, what we create with our labor, that gives us the right, so to speak, to private property. Mm-hmm. The things that we create with our own hands and with our own labor, that rightfully belongs to us. And the idea of the private property, that's mm-hmm. sort of where it's rooted. And then also John Stuart Mill wrote on liberty, mm-hmm. and Adam Smith also, I've mentioned. They also supported the idea or promoted the idea of the liberty giving you the ability or giving people the ability to just generate their property by their labor.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So can you talk about the new liberalism and the introduction of social justice, the place of property and democracy in a just society?
Well, the new liberalism really focuses on maintaining civil liberties such as equality, redistribution of wealth, and equality of opportunity, creating an environment so that everybody has an opportunity, an equal opportunity, leaving the idea of a free market to just allow that or to maintain that opportunity. But modern liberals then discuss or promote the idea that the state should actually promote that opportunity and essentially working towards economic equality.
So then, from a political standpoint, progressivism then is a politicization of a certain strain of liberalism. That's where you get the progressivism from?
Yeah, progressivism is a bit different from modern liberalism in that the progressives chose, rather than purely economic issues or civil liberties issues, they chose to proceed or to enact or try to reach the ideas that by the state or by the government putting or focusing their energy not so much on the economy but passing policies that allow people to reach their goal. And they really look to government intervention and not just economic like wealth distribution, but promoting laws, like safe water, safe drinking, and economic opportunities, a specific work day and a work length. That was generally a progressive idea.
And Nebraska was kind of a hotbed of progressivism also with William Jennings Bryan. Okay.
Yep.
So, like liberalism, conservatism is more than politically leaning to the right. Let's talk about some of the principles of conservatism. So, how would you define conservatism?
Well, conservatism is generally the idea that there are morals, there's a universal morality, and we should rely on that and we should maintain that. And one of the illustrations or metaphors that I like about conservatism is that we are actually on the shoulders of giants, the giants that have gone before us, and they have established ways and morality and the ways, and we should look back to that, not necessarily go back to them like in a reactionary sense, but just look to the standard built the morals and just the way of behaving, and that our progress or our movement should be much more deliberative or contemplative, and that we really look at issues, not just think that the idea of, progressivism, we need to move progress, or we need to build in progress, and that will lead us to a better society. And conservatism really looks at the idea that we need to, like I said, we need to rely on what has come before us and not be in such a hurry to change things.
Okay. So what is the conservative principle of prescription then?
That gets back to the idea that I mentioned about the sitting on the shoulders of giants, in that the idea of this universal morality, we should really prescribe to that idea. And it's basically the idea, similar to what I mentioned, is that we really don't want to go headlong or rush into progress, or what many people would call progress. Conservatives don't necessarily call it progress, but that we should rely on what has gone before us.
And is it progress or is it really change too?
Change.
Rapid change is not something that would be a normal conservative,
exactly.
Be part of conservatism then.
Exactly. They use the word progress, and many progressives would, conservatives would use the word change. That change is not necessarily good, but progressivism adopts the idea that change is good, or if we direct the change, it is just automatically good or intrinsically good. And conservatives would not buy into that.
So very much like liberalism, conservatism is something that politically now, when we hear about it, it's quite different from what its meaning was historically.
Sure.
Okay. So then, if conservatism does not subscribe to egalitarianism, but variety and imperfectibility, can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, the idea of the variety in that conservatism admits, or at least supports, the idea that variety is important for a strong society, and that people should not be forced into some kind of a box the way they live. And the imperfectibility is they are well, they support the idea, or they strongly support the idea that humans are just naturally imperfectible, and we need to work together to not necessarily try and rush into imperfectibility, to be perfect, but the idea is then to move towards that, but that we will never reach being perfect.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay,
sorry.
so both liberalism and conservatism believe in private property. Can you explain the difference in their views about that?
As far as classical liberalism, and I think I mentioned that, where they believe that our labor creates private property that is ours, and conservatism really focuses on private property as a means to sustain your goals. And stay at that, and not necessarily, like I mentioned, is that not necessarily, rapid change is not good. And so the private property is a way for us to move more deliberative towards the goal.
So can you also talk about the importance of checks and balances in government as far as these isms are concerned?
Sure, the conservatives naturally, actually most isms or most ideologies, at least in America, would focus on the checks and balances to keep any one branch, of the three branches, keep any one branch from gaining too much power, in that the too much power within one branch then could lead to a rapid change, which would be antithetical to a conservative outlook. And so that's mainly the idea, is create these checks and balances, or separation of powers, I guess is another way to refer to it, in that each branch of government has the ability, or have their prescribed powers, and that one cannot override. For example, if the legislature passes a bill that may be against the Constitution, that the courts have the right and the power to declare that law unconstitutional, and then the Senate can go back, or the Senate and the House can go back and change the law based on the court's concerns, I guess.
So an imperial presidency would be antithetical to both liberalism and conservatism then? Okay.
Yeah, very much so.
Okay. So where does libertarianism fit in?
Libertarianism is strongly rooted in classical liberalism, although they don't always focus on mainly economic issues. They also move into what you might consider social issues. Some of the things that are talked about most are many things that conservatives would consider vice, just sort of a hedonist approach, in that if I want to do something that makes me feel good, if I'm not hurting anybody else, that it's not the government's place to tell me I can't do that. And that's probably the different nuance, or the additional aspect to liberalism that breeds into libertarianism.
Okay, so and the libertarianism then would be a little bit antithetical to the moral, imperative of conservatism then.
It is, and many libertarians would be of the opinion that we also see this in utilitarianism, but it's not a widely used ism in today's world. But the idea that we should just, I'm sorry, can you ask that question again?
Sure.
Sorry about that.
That basically the different isms between libertarianism, that the morality that has to do with conservatism, there would be some conflict there, because a lot of the times you hear in modern political discussion, libertarianism and conservatism fairly linked to each other to a large extent.
Many libertarians and utilitarians would be of the persuasion or the opinion that morals are essentially socially constructed, that there is not a universal unchangeable set of morality. And that libertarians would make the argument or pose the case that morals are, like I said, not universal and not unchangeable, that each society and each culture really develops what is considered moral and what is not moral.
Okay, all right, that's very interesting. So let's shift a little and let's talk a little more toward the economic perspective of all of this, and talk about capitalism, communism, socialism, and democratic socialism. So in the United States, capitalism has been strongly associated with both liberalism and conservatism. Why is that?
Well, the conservatism and as far as, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's
I'm so
okay.
sorry.
So the liberalism and the conservatism and their association with capitalism.
Okay, the capitalism, especially conservatism and classical liberalism, they are strongly convinced that the free market will take care of any issues as far as equality goes, the equality of opportunity. If I want to economically prosper, then within capitalism and within a free market, I have the ability and I have the right to pursue that economic growth. And so that relies on, the capitalism is connected to conservatism, and I would say more classical liberalism, but to a degree modern liberalism, in that capitalism is a driver and creates the ability to have this equality. At least if you want to start a business, you can. You have the freedom to enter the market, and if you have a better product or you have a similar product at a better price, then you can sell that. And that's the competition, I guess, within capitalism. And both sides support that.
Okay, so then how do you define communism?
Communism is really just state ownership of essentially most things, that there really isn't the concept of private property, and that by everybody being essentially an owner of everything, that would reduce the ability of some people to prosper and other people to not prosper. It takes the economic activity out of the hands of what is considered the bourgeoisie and the capitalists or the owners of the property. And if the proletariat then takes that property away and they essentially become the leaders of that property and how that property is divided. And also you get into what's referred to as the means of production and the relations of production. The means of production would be how things are produced. And if the worker, pre-communism, the worker really doesn't have a say in the means of production, how things are produced. And they are basically, according to Marx, alienated and estranged from the product of their labor, and that they really have no connection to their labor. And within,
go ahead. Yep.
Within communism, the idea would be that the worker would then have a part ownership, and they would be able to say how things are developed, and they would have more of a connection. So if somebody, for instance, if somebody in construction were to build a bridge, they would have a connection to that bridge because they had an input on how that bridge was constructed. The relations of production is more how those goods are distributed among other people, and the workers really have no say in that prior to communism or prior to Marx.
Now, historically, though, communism has been, it's a very, it's a concept that never really has been brought to fruition because most communist states, China, Russia, there's an incredible element of totalitarianism involved in that. And kind of talk a little about that concept.
Well, there is that concept of totalitarianism, and Lenin actually, his concept was the dictatorship of the proletariat, and you had to have that dictatorship initially because then that would lead to the state withering away. But the idea, one of the reasons that the Soviet Union at that time, and probably even to some extent China, a big reason that they were not successful, or apparently not successful, is they had a very large bureaucracy, and it really wasn't total ownership by the worker. There was a class of people that were really in control, and this authoritarianism, or in many instances, the totalitarianism, in that it created this huge bureaucracy that was inefficient, is difficult to make any changes, and so it essentially stayed in place.
So where does socialism kind of come in between capitalism and communism?
Well, socialism is not necessarily, it's focused on economic inputs or making things a little more economically available. But socialism, in many socialist countries, the state does not own everything, or the people don't own everything. Many times, there are many socialist examples, people will, or the state will own some of the means of production, utilities, railroads, things like that. They will own and control them. And then actually there is essentially a free market to some extent, so that people are able to grow and prosper on their own, but then the government takes away the very large industries. Utilities and railroad come to mind.
Okay. Now, back in the 30s, during the Depression, many of FDR's policies were considered by some to be socialist. Now, he was facing fascism and communism and National Socialism, Nazism. How did he respond to accusations of socialism?
Well, he really struck back. He was guided essentially by Keynesian economics, which John Maynard Keynes presented the idea or proposed the idea that if some of the not lower class, but the people within lower economic ranks,
more disadvantaged.
Yeah, more disadvantaged. They would, if we didn't provide some sort of assistance for them, create jobs, create health care, or some form of health care, that if we didn't do that, then that would actually, society would pay a larger price than if we did that. And he also talked about the idea that a century before FDR, the United States they had abundant resources, abundant land, but they didn't have people to work. They didn't have people to extract the resources from that land. And so he really created jobs in many ways. And he essentially, that is not necessarily what socialism is, because it was just a way to help people get on their feet by creating jobs, not giving them a handout, but a hand up, I guess.
Okay. Now, let's talk about democratic socialism, because that's a new word that's kind of bandied about a lot in our political system. How does that differ from socialism?
Well, democratic socialism would be more of an idea that have the say of the people. There is more involvement by the people of the country or of a society, in that they would have the ability to sort of guide policy, and they are focused on other issues besides strictly economic issues, but they would be of the persuasion or of the opinion that by this democratic process, we are able to help other people, the more disadvantaged people. And regular socialists, not really labeled democratic socialists, they are persuaded or of the opinion that through government economic measures, that would be the best way. So it's either through democratic involvement and policy decisions, through people being able to weigh in on policy decisions. That's more of a source of creating an equal footing or a more equal footing. And the socialists would essentially look to the government to be the financial means to create that.
So in modern democratic socialism, do you have more of an emphasis on social policy issues and less of an emphasis on economics owned by the state?
One of the issues, or one of the things we see in democratic socialism, especially in the Scandinavian or Northwest Europe, basically, they provide health care for many, along the same lines as Keynes, in that if we don't provide those things, or countries that don't provide those things, would then end up paying a much larger price tag, if you will, on the people that don't have health coverage or don't have access to maybe even transportation or jobs or something like that. If those aren't made available to people, then that would translate to a much larger price tag for society.
So why are isms so powerful politically?
Well, I think they are a definite tool for people to label one another, and it actually gets into the idea of political psychology, maybe the in-group and the out-group. And your in-group, or whatever group a person belongs to, they see that group as having the same interests and working towards the same goals, and then the out-group is generally seen as very homogenous, in that they have the same thing, and that way people can label and just make the broad assumption, paint with a broad brush, so to speak, and say, well, anyone who's a liberal wants to support this. Well, a more modern or more contemporary example is comments I've heard that anyone that supports the current president thinks this, or is a racist, or whatever, you know. And it's just a way to paint with a broad brush.
Okay. So is education the best way to avoid this ideological exploitation of isms?
I think it is. I think it also, one of the things that education does is it educates people as far as what these isms really mean, and that it also promotes critical thought, in that we are not just buying the things or supporting the things that we hear somebody else say, and we engage in some critical thought ourselves and take a look at the different issues or the different ideologies of these isms and make decisions based on objective or relevant information, and not, like I said, not just follow the talking heads, so to speak.
I mean, what kind of effect do you think social media has had on the use of all of these isms? Do you think that
in a way, I think it's a little bit strange. I like to think of Twitter, which is very prevalent now, and that people will like to post something very ideologically slanted, and it really doesn't lend it, like social media in general, I don't think lends itself well to rational discussion or reasoned debate. I like to call some of the tweets that I've read, I actually like to call them like rhetorical drive-bys, where people just say a comment and they're expecting people to see the light, so to speak. And like I said, it doesn't really lend itself well to rational discussion or critical thought.
Okay. Well, this has been a bit more theoretical than our typical discussion, but I think it's important to understand these isms and their use in political discussion. Thanks for being with us, Joel, and explaining these complicated terms. I think that you've given the viewers a strong foundation to understand these terms that can be thrown around pretty freely in political discussion, and some really good basis for the historical background of these different things. I am MaryLee Moulton for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, and remember at election time to go vote Omaha. Thanks for being with us.